When the HOA president told me my pool was illegal and had to go, I thought my summer was ruined. But instead of giving in, I found a way to turn their petty rule into the most chaotic, hilarious, and satisfying revenge this neighborhood has ever seen, complete with feathers, quacks, and a whole lot of karma. Asterisk if you love seeing HOA bullies get exactly what they deserve. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because you won't want to miss the next outrageous tale of sweet small-town justice. Asterisk I'd always thought of my backyard as more than just a patch of grass, and a poolet was my sanctuary. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle in the mornings, and the steady sound of the water filter made for the kind of white noise city folk pay apps to hear. I'd sit on my old wooden deck chair, coffee in hand, watching dragonflies skim across the blue surface. The pool wasn't just for swimming. It was a place where time slowed, where summer days stretched long and easy. The neighborhood around me was tidy enough. But it wasn't my heart that beat in its sidewalks, it was the HOA's. From the neatly clipped hedges to the identical mailbox posts, everything in this place was under their watchful eye. I'd managed to keep my head down over the years, paying my dues, staying quiet, and minding my own business. That was my way. I lived here for the peace, not the politics. But the first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp white envelope tucked under my front doormat. The edges were sharp enough to feel like they could cut skin, and the HOA letterhead seemed to almost glare at me through the paper. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stood in the kitchen with it, looking out the window at my pool as the sun shimmered off its surface. I had no idea that this calm, this easy rhythm of life was about to be flipped on its head. The next few days felt strange. The HOA president, a sharp-shouldered man with a permanent squint, started passing by my property more often than usual. He'd linger on the sidewalk just long enough to make it uncomfortable, eyes scanning every corner of my yard like he was looking for a crime scene. I noticed other board members driving slower past my house too, their expressions tight, their eyes catching on the glint of water in my backyard. Something was brewing. By the weekend, the letter's contents had become a grim reality. According to them, my pool wasn't in compliance with some new guideline buried deep in a stack of bylaws no normal person could memorize. It was suddenly deemed illegal, as if I'd built it to hide stolen goods rather than enjoy a swim. The reason didn't matter. Their decision was final. They wanted it drained and dismantled within 30 days. 30 days to erase something that had been part of my life for years. It wasn't just the demand that stung, it was the arrogance of it. They hadn't asked for a conversation, hadn't offered a compromise. They'd decided, and I was expected to obey. That's how the HOA worked. It thrived on control, unbending people until they broke. I could almost hear their smug certainty that I'd just roll over and comply. But as I stood at the edge of the pool, toes digging into the warm concrete, I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. This wasn't just about chlorinated water and blue tiles. It was about the principle. They weren't just taking away my pool. They were stomping on the very reason I lived here in the first place. My backyard was my freedom, my buffer from the noise of the world, and they were trying to take that away with a stroke of a pen. That night, I sat outside long after the sun had gone down. The cicadas droned in the dark, and the pool lights glowed soft and inviting, casting ripples of silver against the fence. It was almost painful, knowing they wanted it gone. I tried to imagine the yard without it, just an empty, flat stretch of grass baking in the heat, and the image felt like a punch in the gut. The air would feel heavier without the sparkle of water. The summers would feel longer, duller. There's a certain kind of quiet rage that doesn't explode right away. It simmers, it waits. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They weren't going to win. I'd grown up in the country, where we learned early that you don't let bullies push you around. You keep your head, watch their moves, and when the time comes, you push back quietly, smartly. And in a way they'll never see coming. Over the next week, the tension was like a shadow following me everywhere. The HOA president's SUV slowed to a crawl whenever he passed, his eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses. I caught him once pretending to check his phone while really taking photos of my yard. It was a game to him, a power trip. Oh, to me, it was personal. The air grew heavier with each day, the summer heat pressing down like a warning. I kept the pool clean, skimming the surface every morning, as if daring them to see how perfect it was. I could feel my neighbors' eyes on me, some sympathetic, some curious, a few even nervous to be seen talking to me. In an HOA-controlled world, siding with the wrong person could put you in their crosshairs. Still, I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me panic. I carried on as usual, mowing the lawn, tending the flowers, floating in the pool on lazy afternoons. But behind that calm exterior, my mind was working like a hawk's, circling, scanning, waiting for the right opening. I didn't know it yet, but the first spark of my revenge was already flickering to life in the back of my head. Quiet and stubborn as an ember in dry grass, the HOA wanted me to drain my pool. But what if, instead of emptying it, I filled it with something they could never have predicted, something they couldn't just write out of existence? The thought was small at first, almost absurd, but the more I sat with it, the more it grew into something sharp, something that could turn their petty decree into a public embarrassment. For now, though, I kept my hands steady and my mouth shut. In small towns and HOA-controlled neighborhoods alike, there's a certain power in letting people think you're beaten. They grow comfortable, smug. And that's when you strike. By the time the 30-day deadline was halfway over, I wasn't just defending my pool anymore. I was planning a spectacle. One that would remind everyone in this neighborhood that rules might bind you on paper, but they can't control your spirit. And when the day came, it wouldn't just be me standing against the HOA. It would be something far louder, far messier, and far more feathered. The backyard that had always been my sanctuary was about to become my battlefield, and the pool that they had declared illegal, it was going to become the stage for the most satisfying act of rebellion I'd ever pulled off in my life. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for days after I first read it, its presence like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. Every time I passed by, my eyes would catch the bold black lettering of the HOA header. I didn't need to open it again to know the words by heart. They'd already burned themselves into my memory. 30 days to dismantle something I had worked for, cared for, and poured both time and money into. 30 days to strip away a piece of my life at first. I tried to imagine the simplest way out. Maybe I could store the pool equipment somewhere, fill the hole, and save myself the trouble of a fight. But the more I thought about it, the heavier that idea became. This wasn't just about a swimming pool, which was about what it represented. It was a place where I'd found quiet after long days, where I'd watched summer storms pass over, where I'd drifted under the sun without a care. It wasn't a luxury to me. It was a part of my home. The days began to blur together. Mornings were still and hot, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and chlorine. I'd sit outside with my coffee, staring at the glistening water, knowing that each sunrise brought me closer to their deadline. There was a strange sort of grief in it, like watching the last leaves cling to a tree in autumn, knowing they'd be gone soon. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to sense my hesitation. They began their little campaign of pressure. An email reminder came first, polite in tone, but firm in its insistence that compliance was mandatory. Then came another letter, this one marked final notice in red ink. They framed it as a matter of neighborhood standards, safety, and property value preservation. as if my pool was a contagious disease threatening to bring the entire community to ruin. It was laughable, but not in a funny way. It was the kind of laugh that sticks in your throat because the truth behind it is bitter. I knew exactly what this was. It was about control. They wanted to prove they could take from me that their authority was absolute. And in that realization, my choice became clear. If I gave in, I wouldn't just be losing my pool. I'd be telling them they could take anything they wanted anytime they wanted. Still, the weight of the decision pressed on me. Fighting them would take effort, planning, and a willingness to endure whatever they threw my way. They could find me, drag me into meetings, even threaten legal action. The safe choice would have been to obey quietly, let them have this battle, and keep my head down for the future. But every time I tried to convince myself of that, something deep in me pushed back. By the second week, the tension in the neighborhood had thickened like summer humidity. A few neighbors stopped by under the guise of casual conversation, though. I could tell they were curious. Some of them offered quiet, sympathetic nods and half smiles that said they understood but couldn't openly support me. Others kept their distance entirely, unwilling to be associated with someone the HOA had marked for punishment. The HOA president, though, was anything but subtle. He'd slow his car to a crawl whenever passing by, his gaze fixed on my backyard. Sometimes he'd even pull over just far enough down the street that I couldn't see his face, but I could feel the watchfulness all the same. It was like he was waiting for the first sign of surrender, the first swing of a sledgehammer, or the sound of draining water. In the quiet of the evenings, I'd find myself pacing the edge of the pool, running my hand along the smooth stone coping. The water reflected the deep orange of the setting sun, a sight that never failed to calm me. I thought of all the summer nights I'd spent floating here. The fireflies blinking in the distance, the world narrowed down to the soft splash of my own movement. The thought of letting them erase that was unbearable. That's when the first seed of my revenge truly took root. It wasn't a sudden spark. It was more like a shadow slowly taking shape, a possibility that grew sharper with each passing day. If they wanted my pool gone, maybe I could give them something far worse than the problem they thought they were solving. Something legal, but loud. Something they couldn't just sweep under the rug without looking like fools. The idea didn't come fully formed, but it lived in my mind constantly. I began noticing details I'd never cared about before: how much open space surrounded the pool, how shaded certain corners were, how the water's surface seemed to draw in wildlife from the surrounding area. I'd see ducks flying overhead in the early mornings, heading toward the small pond near the edge of the neighborhood. And I began to wonder. The third week brought a shift in my resolve. I stopped thinking about whether I could keep the pool and started thinking about what I could turn it into. There was freedom in that change. Instead of being on the defensive, I began to imagine ways to take control of the situation. The more the HOA tried to corner me, the more creative my thoughts became. Even as I mulled over these plans, kept up the appearance of compliance. I cleaned the pool regularly, checked the water chemistry, and mowed the lawn with almost exaggerated neatness. If the HOA president thought he was watching a man quietly preparing to dismantle his pool, I wanted him to be sure of it. The best traps are set in silence. But late at night, I sat at my desk researching. I learned about permits, animal protection laws, and the surprisingly intricate world of backyard habitats. Every bit of information added another piece to my puzzle. It wasn't enough to make the HOA angry; they were already there. My goal was to make them helpless, bound by their own rules and public perception. By the end of the month's third week, my plan was nearly complete in my mind. It was bold, a little absurd, and entirely mine. I knew it would draw attention not just from the HOA, but from the whole neighborhood. And once it was set in motion, there would be no taking it. Back the decision was no longer a choice between keeping my pool or losing it. It had transformed into something bigger, a personal stand against the quiet tyranny of the HOA. I wasn't just defending my property, defending the right to live without someone else's petty power trip dictating every inch of my life. So, I made my choice. Not the safe one, not the easy one, the right one for me. I would let them come, let them think they'd won, and then I'd show them just how wrong they were. My backyard would not be emptied, it would be filled. And when the day arrived, they'd have to face the one thing they'd never planned. For Bat the pool, my sanctuary was about to become something far more than a place to swim. It was going to be the centerpiece of my quiet, calculated rebellion. And when it happened, it wouldn't just be me standing in defiance, would be an entire flock, and they'd be louder than any HOA meeting could ever hope to be. The idea didn't feel like lightning, it felt like a slow, steady tide creeping in, lapping at the edges of my thoughts, until the whole landscape of my mind was underwater. I didn't wake up one morning with the word ducks carved into my brain. Instead, it began with the smallest of moments, a pair of mallards waddling across the street while I was out for an early walk. Their webbed feet slapped against the warm asphalt, and their bright, curious eyes scanned the yards like tiny inspectors who actually had a sense of humor. I stopped and watched them. They didn't seem in a hurry. The female tilted her head toward the sound of distant splashing, while the male kept a wary eye on a passing car. Something about the scene made me smile, rare thing that month. And then it struck me. These birds belonged to no one. They weren't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. They went where they pleased, swam where they wanted, and no amount of paperwork could stop them. That thought stuck with me like a burr in my mind. By the time I got back home, I was looking at my pool differently. It wasn't just a piece of property under attack, it was potential. It was a stage, and those ducks, if given the chance, could be the perfect performers in my act of defiance. The more I pictured it, the more I realized how poetic it would be. The HOA wanted to strip away the serenity of my backyard. I'd replace it with something even more alive, more chaotic, and far harder for them to remove. But this wasn't the sort of thing you rushed. I knew enough about wildlife to understand that ducks didn't just appear because you wanted them to. They needed reason, food, safety, a place to rest and raise their young. My pool could be that place if I made it welcoming enough. So I started planning quietly, methodically, the same way a farmer might prepare a field before planting. I began by making small, invisible changes. I stopped running the pool filter so often, letting the water lose that hyper-sterile, chemical-perfect appearance the HOA liked to see in their approved pools. I swapped a corner of the deck for a shallow ramp I built from scrap wood, subtle enough that a casual glance wouldn't notice it. This would give any curious waterfowl an easy way to waddle in and out without risking a frantic flapping escape. Next came the food. I didn't throw bread or obvious bait, had to be natural, sustainable, and discreet. I sprinkled a mix of cracked corn and oats in the grass near the back fence, far enough from the street that the HOA wouldn't spot it on their patrols. In the evenings, I'd watch from my kitchen window as small flocks of birds stopped by to peck around. The ducks weren't there yet, but I could tell the yard was slowly turning into a more inviting stop on their daily routes. Every day brought a new layer to the plan. I planted a few shrubs along the fence line, nothing suspicious, just enough to break the openness of the yard and create small shaded spots. Ducks liked cover, and I intended to give it to them. The sound of trickling water was another lure. So I rigged a small solar-powered fountain in the corner of the pool, just enough to create movement and sparkle. Meanwhile, the HOA kept circling. The president's SUV passed by more than ever. I caught him one morning with his phone angled toward my yard, snapping pictures like a tabloid reporter after a scandal. If only he knew the real scandal was still weeks away from hatching. The strange thing was, my quiet rebellion began to change my mood. Where before I'd been tense and angry, now I felt a kind of focused calm. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was acting. Every little addition to my backyard felt like a stroke of paint on a larger canvas. The plan was growing into something bigger than spite. It was becoming art. The first sign that my efforts were working came on a soft, gray morning. I'd stepped outside with my coffee and spotted movement near the far end of the pool. A female. Mallard was standing on the deck, her head bobbing as she surveyed the water. She didn't jump in, but she didn't leave either. She stood there for a long time, dipping her beak in to sip, as if giving her approval. That moment lit a fire in me. I doubled my efforts. I made sure the water level stayed just right, not too deep, not too shallow. I kept the yard quiet and free from anything that might spook them. Over the next week, she returned several times, sometimes alone, sometimes with the male trailing behind. It was as if they were scouting, considering whether this might be a good home. By the fourth visit, they stayed long enough to swim a few lazy laps around the pool. Watching them float, there was strangely satisfying. Two little symbols of freedom gliding where the HOA had said no one should be. And in that moment, I knew this plan wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. But I didn't stop at 2 ducks. I researched migratory patterns, learned which foods would attract more, and even looked into how to make floating nesting platforms. I wasn't just inviting guests anymore. I was building a community. My pool was becoming something the HOA would never be able to handle, a living, quacking protest. The thought of the HOA president standing there, helpless in the face of a dozen ducks splashing in the water, made me smile more than I probably should have. I could already picture the scene, him flipping through his rulebook, looking for the clause that covered unauthorized avian occupancy and finding nothing. They could threaten me all they wanted, but they couldn't ticket the ducks. They couldn't find them. And they certainly couldn't order them to leave. Still, I kept it quiet. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not the sympathetic neighbors, not even the ones I trusted. The fewer people who knew, the less chance word would slip back to the HOA. This had to be a reveal. Sudden and overwhelming, like a curtain lifting on opening night. By the time the final week before the deadline arrived, my backyard felt different. The ducks were coming daily now, not just for a sip or a short swim, but for hours at a time. They preened on the deck, paddled in lazy circles, and even began napping in the shade. I'd see their feathers ruffling in the breeze, the water rippling gently around them, and I felt the satisfaction of someone watching a plan fall perfectly into place. The pool that the HOA had tried to erase had transformed into something untouchable. It wasn't just mine anymore, belonged to nature, and by extension, to everyone who valued freedom over bureaucracy. And soon, very soon, the HOA would have no choice but to stand there and face the consequences of their arrogance, surrounded not by the clean emptiness they demanded, but by the loud, messy, beautiful chaos of the wild. Ask ChatGPT. The morning of the HOA's deadline was strangely quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like the air is holding its breath. I woke before sunrise, not out of nerves, but because I didn't want to miss a single moment of what was about to unfold. I poured my coffee, stepped outside, and was met with the sound I had grown to love, a low, steady chorus of quacks drifting across the yard. The ducks were already there, more than I had ever seen at one time. At least a dozen glided across the water in loose clusters, some diving briefly beneath the surface, others preening on the deck. The early morning light painted the pool in shades of gold and silver, each ripple sparkling like a quiet celebration. This was no accident. This was the final form of my plan, come to life. Over the past week, they had multiplied. First 2, then 4, then 8. A combination of regular feeding, safe cover, and the unspoken invitation of the water had made my pool the premier duck destination in the neighborhood. They weren't visitors anymore, they were residents. The pool had become theirs as much as mine. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew my attention to the street. A dark SUV rolled slowly into view, and I didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. The HOA president always arrived early, always wanting to be the first to observe and report. He stopped directly in front of my property, engine idling, his face a pale rectangle behind tinted glass. For a few moments, he didn't move. I imagined him trying to process what he was seeing, the pool still full, sparkling in the morning sun, and every inch of it alive with motion. A large drake flapped his wings, sending a spray of water into the air. Another hopped out of the pool entirely, waddling over to peck at something on the deck. The others quacked lazily, utterly unconcerned. By the watchful eyes across the street, the president eventually stepped out of his vehicle, a clipboard in hand. His shoes crunched against the pavement as he made his way to the edge of my property. He didn't step onto my lawn, he never did, but he stood there, pen poised, scribbling notes furiously. I imagined the words, multiple ducks present. Known compliance continues. Action required. But there was no action he could take. That was the beauty of it. The ducks weren't mine in any legal sense. I hadn't purchased them, trapped them, or forced them to stay. They were free creatures, coming and going as they pleased. All I had done was make my yard appealing enough for them to choose it. And in doing so, I had created a problem. The HOA could not legislate away. By mid-morning, the scene had grown even livelier. More ducks arrived in small groups, their wings beating the air before splashing down onto the water. The pool was alive with movement, tiny whirlpools where they paddled in circles, flashes of green and brown as they dove for bits of food. Droplets sparkling in the sunlight each time they shook out their feathers. The air was filled with a steady din of quacks, splashes, and the occasional sharp whistle from a drake asserting his space. Word traveled quickly. By late morning, a few curious neighbors had wandered over, lingering on the sidewalk with amused smiles. Some took out their phones, snapping pictures or recording short videos. A couple of kids giggled at the sight, pointing as one duck waddled right up to the shallow ramp and into the water with a dramatic splash. The ducks didn't care about the audience. They had claimed the pool as their own stage. The HOA president, however, was far from entertained. He stood rigid, the faintest twitch of his jaw betraying his frustration. Every quack seemed to needle him further. He made phone calls short, clipped conversations where his voice carried just enough for me to hear the sharp tone. I imagined him reaching out to the other board members, demanding they convene an emergency discussion on unauthorized wildlife habitation. But the truth was, there was nothing in their precious rulebook that covered this. The HOA could dictate the color of my shutters, the height of my grass, even the type of plants I was allowed to put in the front yard, but they had no jurisdiction over wild ducks. They couldn't drain the pool without trespassing, and they couldn't force me to remove the birds without running afoul of animal protection laws. For once, they were out of their depth. As the day wore on, the ducks became bolder. Some wandered into the grass, dabbling in the sprinkler puddles I'd let form overnight. Others floated lazily in the deepest part of the pool, heads tucked into their feathers for midday naps. The more comfortable they became, the more obvious it was that they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. By early afternoon, the HOA president had been joined by 2 other board members. They stood in a small huddle near the curb, talking in hushed tones, gesturing toward the pool as though trying to work out a plan. One of them, a tall woman with a sharp bob haircut, looked visibly annoyed when a duck quacked loudly in the middle of her sentence. I stayed in the background, pretending to busy myself with garden work, though I kept one eye on their every move. My role was passive, Now the stage was set, the performers were in place, and the show was running itself. All I had to do was let nature continue what it had started. The afternoon sun baked the pavement, and eventually the HOA group dispersed their frustration, practically hanging in the air. I knew they'd be back, probably with printouts of bylaws and empty threats, but I also knew it wouldn't matter. The ducks were here because they wanted to be, and no committee could dictate their movements. As the day drew to a close, the golden light of evening poured over the backyard. The ducks settled into a tranquil rhythm, some preening by the water's edge, others gliding silently across the glassy surface. The sounds of the neighborhood faded into the background, replaced by the soft, organic soundtrack of water and wings. Standing there, watching them, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving that even in the most tightly controlled environments, life has a way of breaking through. The HOA had tried to impose its will, to bend my world to fit their narrow vision. And in the end, they'd been met with a force they couldn't control. Pure, unfiltered nature. The pool that was once a symbol of my quiet retreat had become a living protest, a reminder that rules can only reach so far. And as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon, I knew this was far from over. The ducks would return tomorrow and the day after that, each visit another small victory. For now, though, I simply listened to the gentle sound of water lapping against the sides of the pool, the occasional quack drifting into the evening air, and I let the satisfaction wash over me. The HOA had lost control, and there was nothing they could do to take it back. The days following the deadline were unlike anything my neighborhood had ever seen. What began as a flock of a dozen ducks had grown into a full-blown colony. Every morning, the pool was alive with motion before the sun had fully risen, ripples dancing across the surface, wings flashing in the light, and the air filled with a low, constant hum of quacks, splashes, and the occasional squabble over floating oats. It wasn't just my backyard anymore. It had become a sanctuary, a haven that seemed to draw more life with each passing day. The HOA, however, was unraveling. The president had returned every morning without fail, sometimes accompanied by other board members, sometimes alone, always with that same stiff-back stance of a man who believed he should be in control but wasn't. They stood at the curb, jotting notes, taking photos, and gesturing in frustrated bursts toward the pool as though pointing at the problem would somehow make it disappear. But the ducks didn't care. They moved with the slow, steady confidence of creatures who belonged exactly where they were. Few had even started nesting near the shrubs I'd planted weeks earlier, their soft bodies tucked into the shade, heads swiveling lazily at the sound of movement. These weren't temporary guests anymore. They were residents, and they were multiplying. By the end of the week, there were ducklings. Tiny, down-covered balls of yellow that paddled awkwardly after their mothers, peeping in high-pitched bursts. They bobbed like corks in the shallow end, their small wakes spreading across the water like miniature signatures. The moment I saw them, I knew my plan had entered a new phase. If adult ducks had been an inconvenience for the HOA, a brood of ducklings would be an absolute nightmare. The neighborhood began to take sides. Some people loved it. I'd catch them walking by with smiles on their faces, snapping photos, or crouching low to watch the ducklings from the sidewalk. Others, especially those with strict HOA loyalties, looked at me like I was single-handedly dismantling civilization. I didn't care either way. My job wasn't to win their approval, was to make it absolutely clear that the HOA's authority had limits. The president escalated his efforts. One afternoon, he arrived with a man in a city-issued polo shirt and a clipboard. They walked the perimeter of my property together, stopping often to whisper and nod. I stayed indoors, watching from the kitchen window as they attempted to document every detail: the ramp, the nesting shrubs, even the food scattered discreetly in the grass. They left without knocking, and I knew why. They had nothing. No law was being broken, no ordinance violated. Their next move was predictably desperate. I received another letter. This one filled with vague threats about community, harmony, and property devaluation, and strongly worded requests to remove all conditions encouraging the habitation of waterfowl. I didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. The ducks were free to come and go as they pleased, and I couldn't be held responsible for their choices, at least. Not in any way the HOA could enforce. Every day that passed without their victory seemed to eat at them. The president stopped disguising his frustration, his once casual patrols becoming stiff, angry marches. The board members whispered when I passed them at the community mailbox. Rumors began to circulate claims that the ducks were unsanitary or damaging the ecosystem. But anyone who spent even a minute watching them could see the truth. My backyard had become the healthiest, most vibrant patch of land in the neighborhood. And then came the moment that sealed everything. A local news crew showed up. I didn't invite them. Someone else must have tipped them off. They parked on the curb, unloaded their camera gear, and began filming the scene: ducklings swimming, mothers guiding them, sunlight glittering off the water. The reporter interviewed a few neighbors, most of whom spoke fondly about the duck pool and how it had become a unique fixture in the area. When the HOA president spotted the cameras, his face darkened. He tried to speak to the reporter, waving his hands in animated frustration, but it was clear the story had already chosen its angle. The ducks weren't a problem. They were a heartwarming community feature, and the footage would be broadcast across the county that very evening. That night, I sat in my living room watching the segment air. The shots were beautiful slow pans. Across the water, close-ups of ducklings paddling in a neat line, and soft background music that made the whole thing feel like a nature documentary. They interviewed a few locals, one of whom called it the most peaceful part of the neighborhood. The HOA's stance was mentioned briefly, but it was framed as a petty disagreement against something charming and harmless. From that point on, the ducks became untouchable. Any attempt to remove them would be seen as an attack on a beloved community treasure. The HOA's threats lost their bite. Their letters became less frequent, their visits shorter, their presence more reluctant. The president still passed by occasionally, but now he did so without stopping, his gaze fixed forward, pretending not to notice the rippling water and the flashes of feathers. I, on the other hand, noticed everything. I noticed the way the ducklings grew stronger, more coordinated, their peeping replaced by deeper quacks. I noticed how the adults seemed more at ease, drifting lazily in the afternoons, without keeping constant watch. I noticed how the air in my backyard felt lighter now, filled with movement and sound that no rule could silence. Revenge has many forms. Sometimes it's loud and confrontational, a direct strike meant to overpower. But this was the quiet kind, the slow-burning kind that worked not by force, but by permanence. The HOA had tried to erase something from my life, and in doing so, they had given me the opportunity to create something better, something they could never truly touch. The pool had started as my private retreat, then become my battleground, and now it was my victory monument. It stood as proof that the human instinct to control will always be weaker than the natural drive to exist freely. The ducks didn't care about politics or bylaws. They didn't care about committee votes or compliance deadlines. They cared about water, food, and safety. And I had given them all three. As summer wore on, I found myself spending more time outside than I ever had before. Evenings were my favorite, when the light turned amber and the ducks settled into their calm routines, the water catching every last glimmer of the setting sun. I'd sit on the deck, coffee or iced tea in hand, and listen to the gentle music of my backyard. The pool that was once threatened with emptiness now overflowed with life. The HOA never admitted defeat, not officially, but they didn't have to. Their silence was victory enough. I had beaten them without breaking a single rule, without raising my voice, without giving them a single legal foothold. My revenge wasn't just satisfying, it was untouchable, and every quack, every ripple, every new brood of ducklings was a reminder that I hadn't just protected my pool. I had transformed it into something they could never take away. The best kind of justice isn't the one you demand, it's the one that keeps living right in front of your enemy's eyes. Day after day, season after season, until they finally stop looking.